Hi Guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. In the hot seat this week, I'm your host Lavarius and we will be covering North and South. This is a strategy game with a mix of battles and serious humour. It's a very strange one to cover and I'm quite curious to see how this is going to turn out. As an aside, before we get to that though, we do need to cover some of this week's Amiga news. The first thing I have to mention this week is the recent AMIGATHON that happened on the 20th of July over on the Amigo's YouTube Retro Gaming channel. Now, they held a 12-hour straight Amiga gaming marathon, which I did manage to sit through a good 11 hours of. I managed to miss the start thanks to YouTube's awful notification system, but as soon as I was in there, I couldn't stop watching, and I was right there up until the end. They raised over $3,000 for the Children's Miracle Network of Hospitals, I think, and I got to see them play things like Super Hang-On, Mr. Nuts and Dogfight, all really good games, and all ones I thought were amazing choices to cover in a show like that. I do listen to their show every week, as you guys know I've mentioned them time after time before here, and it was a pure joy to watch this. I had a great time, so thanks to the Amigos guys for such an awesome day. Now, there's a full upload of it on their YouTube channel, so go check that out on YouTube if you want to see what actually happened. I think you can go back and read all the comments and stuff. I was in there, and as were many other people. Pixel Vixen, 10-minute Amiga Retro Cast, Retro Ravi, and even Amiga Bill turned up at one point. It was as star-studded as you can get for the Amiga stuff. It made for an amazing Saturday, and I'm really glad that I stayed all the way through to the end. I will be doing the same next year as well, because this is becoming sort of a regular thing now, and I'm definitely sure that they're going to do another. That was the third one, I think. One thing that did happen during the event was Ravi from the Retro Hour podcast popped up during the live chat and suggested that maybe next year there could be something similar in the UK. We don't really have any sort of Amiga live events like that. I thought it was a really good idea, so who knows what might come from that. I might be talking to a few other people. I mean, I might be tempted as I've got all the streaming camera gear, so stay tuned to the news, guys, because who knows what's going to happen next. I'll see what I can do. Up next is just a tidbit of news that I managed to stumble upon Facebook a few weeks ago. Raymond DeVerd has got his hands on some original Amiga 2000 system schematics. He's posted all sorts of pictures online with an explanation of where it came from, but the best part is that back in 2015, he asked Dave Haney to sign it. In case you weren't aware, Dave was one of the original A2000 engineers, so it must have been as big a shock to him seeing these documents again as it was to the guy actually managing to get his hands on them. I wanted to mention that because stuff like this should always be shared far and wide. I hope he uploads it in future as a full scan, as there isn't really any scans of this online so far, and it'd be a real shame if this stuff stayed hidden away forever. I'm going to go a bit Indiana Jones here and just say future generations will want to see it. Stuff like this shouldn't be just shoved in a cupboard. Lastly, there's another new Amiga game that seems to have passed me by. Now, this came out sometime in April, so earlier this year. It's a smaller release this time, so probably not something many of you guys will have heard of. It's called Sardonic. Now, this is a scrolling shooter made by Madax, and from what I could see of it, it's a remake of a much earlier PC game. Now, I think this one came out in the early 2000s. Looking at the details for it, it will work on all Amigas, and there's even an AGA version if you fancy it, giving it a whirl on an A1200, and I think it does have much fancier graphics. This is not exactly up to Deluxe Gallagher levels of quality, by the way. It seems to repeat its levels with a non-stop rush of enemies. It's very arcadey though, and it feels more like an early public domain game than anything major. But I had a fun-filled 10 minutes with it, so I thought it was well worth mentioning. It is free, and they've done a good enough job, so it's well worth bringing up on the show. I don't really hear much about public domain releases anymore, and I'm sure there's bound to be a fair few of those being made today. over to you lot, but is there even a scene for this stuff anymore? I mean, I'm always dabbling lightly on Amiga sites looking for news to bring up, so if anyone can recommend something that I might have missed or is a really good public domain game that's come out instead of the last 18 months or something, then drop me a line in the usual places. You never know, we might find some really decent stuff to cover for the show. Anything I've mentioned today will have a link in the show notes. And I think that's all we have time for in news this week, so let's blow on that bugle and go play some North and South. Some games seem to pop up every so often and cry out to be covered, or at least get some good coverage in the show. For as long as I've been doing AMIGArama now, listeners have been asking me on and off to do an episode on North and South, and although I've never really been against the idea, I wasn't really sure if there was even enough content here to cover. Now, Mr. Happy requested this back in the middle of June, and I started digging into it again just to see what I could find out, and I'm quite happy to say I did manage to find a fair few interviews and articles to go over, so here we are. I'm no stranger to this as a game. I did play quite a lot of it as a teenager. Weeks and weeks worth if I could recall correctly, and with it being on a single disc, it was always an easy one to cart around to a friend's house for mad playing sessions. Then strangely the game just sort of fell off my radar. I haven't seen or played it since I was a kid, and I never had any desire to return to it since. But AMIGArama is all about rediscovering old games, so we were gonna get round to it eventually. I'm happy to say when I sat down to play it once more for the show, it was like no time had even passed, and I was soon hooked right back into playing it all over again. This is probably the gaming equivalent of riding a bike, so let's see what we've uncovered in today's show. The publisher and developer this time round was Infogrames. Now, they did buy out a hell of a lot of companies and they're still around today. In the Amiga days, they did things like Alcatraz, Bubble Ghost. I would like to do an episode on that at some point. Genghis Khan, Commandos, Outlaw, SimCity, Tetris, etc, etc. They did so many games, they were almost like EA before EA even existed. Though I do believe they were the company that single-handedly destroyed the Ocean name, and it's not something I can ever really forgive them for. I've always had a sort of offhand plan to do some sort of company histories at some point in the show history. I don't know when I'm going to get round to it because I'm aware it requires a lot of research. We will get there one day, and Infogrames and Ocean and all that story will be covered. Now, sorry, let's get aside from that. Let's move back to the game. This came out in 1989. It was just on one floppy disk and it was for 2 players. I don't know why I thought this was for 4 or more. It was priced at £24.99. The coders behind it were Alan Nakash, who only ever worked on this, Stephen Bordeaux, and he worked on Draken, Operation Neptune, and had a hand in SimCity as well. That must have been some background conversion or coding. William Henneboy, he only did Bobo and Stir Crazy. No idea what those were. Graphics wise, it was a team of 6. Elaine was involved again in this, and people like Lorraine Charbonnet and Sophie Core. Between them all, they did Bobo, 7 Colours, Stir Crazy, Light Corridor, SimCity comes up there again, and something with an awesome name, Draken. Music-wise, it was Charles Calais. He has quite the interesting audiology. Blood, Bob, Goblins 2 and 3, Metal Masters, Tintin on the Moon, etc, etc. I would really like to do the Tintin games. I do remember them as a kid and quite enjoyed them. Also, to round this off, Stefan Baudet. I can't pronounce that name. Is it Stefan or Stephen? That's probably my writing. Anyway, he did Draken, Operation Neptune, SimCity, etc. Apologies to those guys if they ever listen to the show. I promise I do not do this on purpose. I just can't pronounce names properly. If you think that's bad, I can't even pronounce my own surname correctly, so I have no chance with other people's. North and South is based on an original Belgian comic called Les Toniques Blues, which was created by Roel Corvin. It has a strikingly similar art style and mix of humour to what's in the Asterix comics. At least that's what it reminded me of. I was familiar with both as a kid and always thought that North and South was done by the same person behind the Asterix comics. It's just how close they looked in my mind. Over the years, it's been passed between several different artists and it still seems to be going on today. The comic itself is based around the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and although from what I've read it has a mix of humour and seriousness about it at the same time. I'm really sorry to say, American listeners, that I don't know much about the American Civil War at all. Probably my closest to do with it is that film, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, and that's one of my all-time favourite films, but that doesn't really count, does it? I guess I'm an Amiga gamer, damn it, not a historian. For a game like this though, Infogrames would seem to be the perfect match, working on games like Passengers on the Wind, and after a lot of success in the past with that, they wanted to focus more on comic book licensed properties. They did try to get licenses for series like Tintin, but that was one of the more expensive at the time, and for a company just starting out, it just wasn't financially viable. As they produced more and more hits though, things would eventually change for the company and they did get round to the Tintin license several years down the line. Looking internally for someone to work on the title, Stefan Baudet stepped forward to volunteer. Being a fan of toy soldiers growing up, he'd always wanted to create a game based around small soldiers fighting. North and South seemed to be the dream chance for him to make something he really loved. When you look at different types of game styles back then, there wasn't really any sort of RTS genre to speak of, and most of what was made was just done from scratch. The American Civil War was perfect to try out his ideas on, and even he admits the real inspiration for the strategy elements in the game came from the Risk board game. For the most part of the game design, Stefan worked on the battlefield elements, with the rest of the work being split with other developers. The US map, for example, was created by Vincent Belliard, who later went on to create one of France's first ever internet portals. That's something for history fans there. There are a large number of mini-games used to depict different scenes throughout the game, but during a prolonged development, the staff realised that they didn't really like them at all. Infogrames, being your typical publisher, were chasing them to get it out the door as quickly as possible. They really had to keep them in so as not to waste any of the resources or work they'd done. That's what we ended up with. When it came to the comic book art, there was a strong push to try and match the original comic art style and keep in as much of the comics humour as possible with what the Amiga could actually do. So much so that when Willy Lambill, one of the artists, saw what they'd managed to achieve, he was truly amazed by it because he'd never actually seen his comic characters in action before. I guess as gamers we forget this sort of thing, but if you're like an original author, seeing your work come to life like that, there's nothing really that can match that sort of medium. Even today, there's no real connect between the two. One thing I will point out, and tidbit of comedy that they managed to use within the game that managed to show off the sort of humour from the comic books, was when the players are at the main title screen. You can poke the photographer in the backside for a funny response. Now, this was just a random suggestion thrown in by Frederick Reinhold, who would later go on to create Alone in the Dark. After coding had finished on the main game, the Atari and ST versions were the first to be released, with the 8-bit ports following much later on. It wasn't really a huge seller, I'm sad to say, but as word spread about the game, it really did take off and just kept selling and selling over years to come. The odd gameplay and comic book stylings mean it has fast become an Amiga fan favourite, and it often pops up in all sorts of best of hit lists and popular games. Now, ports wise, this turned up on the Amstrad CPC, Atari's STE, Commodore 64, MSX 1 and 2, the good old Nintendo NES. I'm actually quite familiar with that because it's quite a rare cartridge. The PC port, and finally the good old ZX Spectrum. That's quite a good range considering it wasn't really any sort of hit in the early days. Your objective is to ensure victory for your side, north or south, by eliminating all the enemy armies. You will be controlling armies across all the combat zones of the Civil War. You may respect history or not, as you like. While North and South does not try to reconstitute history and places playability over realism, Infogrames has made every attempt to eliminate the atmosphere and overall strategic conditions of the Civil War. Thus, as in reality, the player may choose to advance deep in the south or north, to attack in the centre, or to attempt a turning movement. This is all based on a comic book, so you can't really be expecting Lord of the Rings style plotting. It's a simple war premise done well, so it's all we should really expect from Infogrames, and they haven't scrimped on the setting for this at all. Before loading the main game, you are presented with an army camp menu system with a cheeky photographer on hand to snap black and white photos of when you actually start the game. You can choose whether to play as yourself or for 2 players, and even have a different commander for each battle in a corresponding year. The years on offer will let you fight in different time periods of the Civil War, and the battlefield will change to match what was roughly going on at the time. This isn't a historical piece though, so don't be expecting too much accuracy there. From the main menu, one of the most pleasing aspects of North and South has to be the number of adjustable options for each game you can play. You aren't going to be spending large amounts of time playing each game, so it lets you choose different catastrophes like rain or American Indians even who can attack units at random during gameplay, or an angry Mexican who can drop the odd bomb onto either side during play. There's even a chance to turn on random storm clouds and ship reinforcements too. These add a great deal of replayability as you can adjust whether or not to use them for each game. In the early stages, it's best to limit their use until at least you can learn the ropes, but being able to add more challenge later is always a very handy way to extend the overall game. Arcade mode, again we're still on the main menu, lets you play every part with lots of action and gameplay. It's the ideal way to play by far as you get to see most of the game. But for those who aren't in the mood for joystick waggling, there's always the strategy mode. That's where the challenges are decided automatically. It reminded me more of a simulation to watch rather than play, and it makes for more of a thinking man's game, without the stress of having to worry about what to do with the joystick. The arcade mode consists of 3 different challenges, a standard battle on a single screen, most of the time being on a field or the desert with rivers or a bridge included in there. Often these will have some building or rocks to hide behind, and it's a mad dash with soldiers from both sides charging each other in either a close or split formation. The goal here simply being to try to take out as many enemy units as possible. The units have cannons, foot soldiers and cavalry, with each providing their own levels of destruction. Artillery, for example, are limited in number and they are slow to fire, but when timed just right will do the most damage to enemy units. You can of course just back away and retreat, so it's not always death to all foes on screen. You can use the joystick or keyboard to move around any of the challenges, and the game limits you to a single button press with a keyboard shortcut to change the units. I did find that it was often best to cheat a little bit and let WHD load add a second fire button in there. It made for much easier battles. I've done that for this episode, so you'll have to forgive me in this case. It made the fights, at least I found, more fun, but it's all down to the player, and you will need to decide if you want to stick to the original game design or have a neat little improvement. 2 buttons are always better than 1. Battlefields are often real battles of attrition, and even when you're extremely limited or even losing, thanks to having direct control over the units, it's still possible to play well enough and win. The next challenge allows your character to run through a fort, climbing up and down ladders, fist fighting with enemy units, and trying your best to avoid dogs or bombs. It's just a matter of getting to the flag at the end. Yes, that's as madcap as it sounds, and all this literally has to be done in a race against the clock along the bottom of the screen. It's actually racing away from you. You've got to keep up with it. Luckily, you aren't unarmed though, and at least get a few knives to throw out, which can make these sections less brutal. But often, it's all about scrambling to the flag as quickly as possible, and it's best to avoid the fight just to stop losing too much time. I am trying my best to explain what this is like, and I haven't even mentioned the map screen yet. This is the main focus for the gameplay, and it plays just like the board game Risk. Either side can move to capture or combine with other units on the same side, as well as being able to tackle enemy forts or jump aboard a train that runs along the south of the map. Capturing a couple of stations along this line will net you a steady income from the train passing through in the future, so it's always worth taking a shot at completing the train sections. The trains are always on the move, and it's your job to make your way to the end, leaping from carriage to carriage, avoiding enemies and using the chance to steal the gold on the train. This can be used to boost your army, and 5 bags of gold will let you add a whole new army unit. Something which is a must with the large amount of battles always going on screen. Taking a unit and moving it onto a different section of the map will launch a challenge, but you need to think strategically a lot of the time, having to decide if you will capture virgin territory or capture an enemy flag. The choice is down to you, which is why it also offers a lot of freedom in game. The animation and cartoon styling for such an early Amiga game really put me in mind of The Lion King again. I know we covered that recently, but it just didn't do enough with the gameplay and graphics to make it all worthwhile. Here, the cartoony look put me in mind of that hand-drawn animation, and every frame of the characters on screen is charming and vibrant, and it's very colourful. From winning to losing, the game over screens always manage to put a smile on my face with their cheeky humour and movement animation, making them really stand out from all other games that I've seen, at least with still images. Again, going back to The Lion King, why didn't we get that from the Mega Drive version? It just looks so good. We get exactly the same thing from Settlers with its opening intro. I couldn't help but think of Lemmings and Walker when I saw the battle screens. They all share that pixelated small look with just a tiny bit of animation to make them look so much more than they actually are. They're still tiny pixels though, so it's best not to look too closely. For once, I was actually a bit confused when it came to the music. I could have sworn there were loads of tracks filling every section. What we have though is a flurry of sound effects from the toot of horns, bugles, weapons and silly noises spread throughout the entire game. Add in a winning theme or losing tune and it's easy to be tricked into thinking there's a lot more audio going on than North and South actually offers. I do hope we've covered this enough there. It really is a madcap game with loads and loads of different things going on. But what it consists of basically is a mini game fest with a central map in the middle. It's a lot of fun, but we need to move on to its problems. First up, the strategy element might just be a bit too simplistic for some people. This isn't the sort of long thinking game where you will be losing hours and hours to conquering the other army. It's meant to be played in short, fun bursts, and that just might not be enough for people into more serious strategy games, expecting them to last a lot longer. Another issue I found, there's actually a trick to win battles every time, and once you figure it out, it can spoil that part of the game. Though don't worry, I won't share it here because I don't want to ruin people's fun. It's a bit like the goal scoring issue that FIFA had. Once you discover it, it can be a real struggle not to use it, and I want you to try this game at least once and enjoy it yourself properly. It could really do with some more music tracks, as it's quite limited to what's on offer, but at least the sound effects do a really good job of fooling you that it's not quite as bad as it really should be. I will say though, when they get so much right with a game, it's very easy to forgive what could be a glaring issue for lots of other games. The magazine scores for this were 90% from your Amiga, Amiga Computing 90% as well, that's really up there, CU Amiga 86%, followed by Amiga Action on 84%, starting to drop now, Amiga Format 74%, and the worst one of the bunch, the one at 68%. The scores were quite high for North and South overall, with only a few magazines pointing out major issues. A few would drop those scores even further when it came to a budget re-release later, but I get the feeling this is all down to the person who plays it. The game isn't very deep and it won't challenge most people who are after a tough battle sim, but on the other hand, it's fast paced with a simple combat system that's oodles of fun. I can't help but be reminded of people who go to see a movie and talk about turning the brains off for a couple of hours. Just approach this as a standard popcorn flick and try to have some fun with it. It's a game after all. Yes, it's strategy based, but it's not meant to be taken too seriously. You really just have to try your best to try and enjoy it. I couldn't help but be reminded of the Asterix comics, and although it doesn't have that same sort of humour, it's a lot sillier than those comics ever aim to be. Comparing the real world comics to the actual visuals in the games and what they've managed to do, it stands up really well, much more than anything else I've played on the Amiga so far, at least to this style. This is never going to be the sort of game that everyone who plays it will love. If you don't get on with the quick battles or the limited battle simulation, you might not be able to understand the joy a quick blast on this can bring you. I didn't have to spend very long learning how to play it, and it's all quite intuitive to pick up after just a couple of goes. I can understand why so many people see this as an Amiga classic. It's perfectly approachable and a great way to lose a quick 20 minutes here and there for some clashes. I've always been a fan of this, even if it slipped to the back of my mind over the years, and for me, North and South deserves all the beloved praise. It's just that good. It's so much fun. I've no idea if many other strategy games can match the battles in this, but if they are half as fun with what's on offer here, then I'd love to find out what I'm in store for. We haven't tackled many strategy games on the show. You know the drill, guys and girls. Let me know if I've missed something amazing, and I'll do my best to try and cover it in a future episode. And it's about time to wrap up the show. If you've heard anything today that you disagree with or want to comment on in general, you can drop me on the line on nefarious@amigarama.com, or even drop me a line on Twitter, which is @AMIGARamaPod. And we do seem to be building up quite a big community of people on there, which I'm always glad to talk to. Before we disappear for the day though, we need to thank all of our current Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join in or join this group of Amiga veterans, you can do so on patreon.com/AMIGArama. And this week our Patreons are 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Gary Heather, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, Jan Holbo Rasmussen, Jason Warnes, Laurent Giraud, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Pistol, Peremsky, Quentin Barnes, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Richard Pearson, Steve Engeldo, Sneff and Treble. Yeah, linking those two names at the end does sound a lot better. Anyway, thanks for listening and until next time, guys.